Savannah, Hoda, good morning to both of you. As we just heard there, lots to unpack on this Friday morning. To do that, let's bring in NBC political analyst and former Democratic Senator Claire McCaskill and Rich Lowry, editor of the National Review. Good morning to both of you. Senator, I'll start with you. Two candidates, 1,200 miles apart, roughly, perhaps an apt metaphor for where our politics are right now in this country. Any hearts and minds changed in either town hall last night?
I'm not sure. I think most people watched the candidate they were supporting. If there were undecided voters that watched both, I think they saw quite a startling contrast. I think the president's performance stood out for everything he doesn't know. He doesn't have a plan for health care to protect pre-existing citizens. He doesn't know if he owes $421 million to foreign banks. He doesn't know whether he took a test as the rules required on the day of the last debate. He doesn't even know what QAnon is, even though his supporters show up with those T-shirts and those signs at every single one of his rallies. It was, frankly, once again showed that the president has a very tortured relationship with the truth.
Rich, one of the things that I found striking in the Trump town hall, how little the president mentioned Joe Biden. He didn't really seem to go after the vice president directly as much as he has in the past. What were your takeaways from both of the town halls?
Yeah, well, I agree with that. And it really goes to the key paradox and dynamic of this race. The Trump town hall, much better TV. You understand why this guy was a TV star before he was president of the United States. He's just a very compelling figure. And usually in presidential politics, in any political race, you want to be the more compelling figure. But in this case, you don't. He doesn't want the race just to be a referendum about him, but inevitably it is all about him. So, Biden on ABC was detailed, but also dull and meandering, and just there's nothing really of interest there or to get your hooks into. And I think that's one of the key problems for this president and his reelection campaign.
Rich, to Claire's point there, last night the president talking about QAnon, at first saying he didn't know what it was, and then admitting he knew a little bit about what they stood for. 2 weeks ago, the Proud Boys. The president seems to continue to have difficulty just full stop denouncing fringe white supremacy groups. Why is that? Why does he have such a hard time doing that? And is there a political calculation there?
Well, I think he's repeatedly denounced white supremacy. What we saw last night is completely irresponsible, where he wouldn't denounce QAnon, this poisonous conspiracy theory. And I think the reason is that he knows a lot of these people like him and support him, and he doesn't want to do anything to alienate anyone on his side, even if they're beholden to a crazy theory. So that was not a great moment.
Senator McCaskill, this idea of court packing, adding seats to the Supreme Court to tilt the balance of power. We've talked about this over the last few weeks. Vice President Biden's gotten the question a few times. Senator Kamala Harris has gotten the question a few times. They still don't seem to have figured out the best way to answer. Last night, Mr. Biden seems to have settled on promising an answer before the election, but after the Senate votes. What's the thinking here? What's the strategy?
Well, I think first of all, it's a tough question. Second of all, I think Joe Biden has mixed emotions about it. He's said over and over again he's not a fan of court packing. It has happened various times in our history when one party has gotten carried away or where there has been some kind of gross imbalance. And I think he's trying to wait to see what the American people think of the idea that for the first time in history, the Senate is blowing up every rule they have to ram through a nominee that's main views are out of step with most Americans.
Next debate, just a few. Go ahead.
It's not a tough question. It's not a tough question. This would be one of the most radical measures in American history. The Supreme Court's been nine since the 1860s. FDR, at the height of his power, tried to pack the court, was rebuked by Congress. So he should just be able to give a straight answer, and he won't. He showed a little more leg last night and said he'll actually do the American people the favor of telling them whether or not he's going to support this before the election, which is certainly nice. But if you're going to be the candidate of norms and our institutions, your answer on this has to be no. I will not destroy the legitimacy the Supreme Court, and he just refuses to do that.
Rich, we are now 6 days away from the final debate. As you know, President Trump trailing in just about every national poll that's reliable, trailing in most of the battleground state polls as well. What does the president need to do on Thursday to try and close the gap with Mr. Biden?
Well, he needs to shake up the race. He needs to have a strong and aggressive performance, but nothing like the first time, which, again, made it all about him and was repellent to a lot of people, and get this race closer and then hope for a turnout miracle at the end. And a lot of the polls hope that a lot of the polls are wrong. Senator
McCaskill, really quickly, what does Vice President Biden need to do Thursday?
I think he needs to do exactly what he's doing right now. And by the way, if America makes up their mind on which candidate supports the norms and institutions of the presidency, I don't think this race will be close. I think Joe Biden would win in a landslide.
Senator McCaskill, Rich Lowry, enjoy the weekend. Thank you both.
Thank you very much.